Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
It's our pleasure to welcome back our guest from last week, Jack Reynolds, who for over 30 years was a reporter with NBC News. His last assignment with them started in 1983 when he was the Pentagon correspondent. You have seen him many times on such programs as the NBC Nightly News and the Today program. Much of his time was spent traveling around the world reporting for NBC. He spent 16 years in the Far East, and much of that concentrated on such countries as China and Japan. In fact, he reported from 20 Far Eastern countries. He also covered the conflict between Israel and Lebanon. He was in a number of other countries reporting over the years. Afghanistan was on his tour duty, in which he went in to talk with the freedom fighters and even interviewed Russian soldiers. We've invited him back, and we've agreed that we'll spend the great portion of this program on his many trips, over 50, to the People's Republic of China. And I'm happy to welcome to the panel again Steve Schink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall invite Steve to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. Jack, in all those trips to China, could you give us an idea, put that in historical perspective, the kind of time frame that you covered and some of the major changes that have taken place?
Yeah, the first trip was in late '71 with the American ping pong team. And close on that was the first Nixon trip. The last trip was last summer. And the only way that I can describe the contrast between those two is mind-boggling. Now, there were fits and starts. For example, up until about 1976, there was an internal struggle in China between what you can call in shorthand the radicals and the moderates. That's sort of inaccurate, but the best you can do in terms of describing what was going on. With the radicals being the Maoists, and pretty much because Mao, not too far into the Cultural Revolution, slipped into the beginnings of his dotage, and Chiang Ching, his wife, was pretty much the moving force behind that. Zhou Enlai desperately trying to maintain some sort of equilibrium in the country and hold the country together while these two factions fought it out, literally fought out pitched battles inside China. Artillery in the streets of Canton, divisional strength battles occasionally, the city of Wuhan being seized by the radicals, several of the high party officials being held hostage by the Red Guards, Zhou Enlai negotiating to release the city. I mean, crazy, bizarre things. Millions of people killed, countless suicides, and so on and so on. This is the Cultural Revolution period. Coming out of that, after '76, the beginnings of a little more stability. An interim ruler in Hua Guofang, who took over briefly. Deng was sent back out into exile for about the second or third time. They call him the Sichuan rubber ball. He kept bouncing back. And finally, in about 1978, Deng back in some sort of control, still trying to ride this log, trying to give China for the first time some sort of continuity of leadership and succession, trying to get in some economic reforms, which have begun to take hold. And the best evidence of that is the last Party Congress, the 13th Party Congress, which, while not a totally sweeping victory for Deng, at least confirmed the fact that the moderates were in fact on the ascendancy. Now, a couple of interesting things about that, which may only be of interest to China watchers or China watchers, but Deng has got to leave behind some concrete form of succession and institutions for what comes after him. He saw what happened after Mao died. Very different in those totalitarian states. Remember what happened after Stalin died, this leadership succession. There aren't the kinds of orderly successions that the democracies have. So Deng is trying desperately to do this. He bet on Hu Yaobang, who was the head of the party. There was a lot of ferment among the students for a lot of reasons. The students with rising expectations, students coming back from the United States and other foreign countries, feeding this prairie fire that started about freedom and democracy and freedom of expression and of ideas and so on. And the students, tens of thousands of them, took to the streets in Shanghai and Beijing and so on. The old mossbacks in the party hierarchy panicked. Deng had to do something, or he would have been accused of being soft. He had to kick out his designated successor, Hu Yaobang, as the head of the party. Now what? Zhao Zhiyang, the other man who was in charge of the government and an economic man, really, a terrific economic administrator, who took one of China's largest provinces, Sichuan, Deng's home province, and transformed it from an economic backwater to a success story, emulated by a lot of other Chinese provinces. Zhao was brought to Beijing, groomed as the government man, almost to take the place of Zhou Enlai. So Hu Yaobang was going to take the party, Zhao Zhiyang was going to take the government. Hu in trouble, he's got to go. What does Deng do? He finally prevails on Zhao Zhiyang to take the party post. And a guy by the name of Li Peng is now in the government. That sets up the potential for conflict because Zhao he has a plan for China that would take advantage of the seaports and the free economic zones and start the economic ball rolling, which would then move back into the countryside. Li Peng is a little more pragmatic, a little more, he was trained in Russia. He wants to develop economic centers throughout the country. A lot of Chinese remember that it was the foreign influence that came in through the seaports that resulted in the unequal treaties, that resulted in the finishing off more quickly than otherwise, the end of the Qing dynasty and so on. So now the scene is set for yet another but more sophisticated and peaceful and, one would hope, rational struggle. The last word I'll say on this, as far as that part is concerned, is that I had dinner last summer in Beijing with some old friends of mine, both of them in responsible posts, and one of them said to me, this country is now beyond the point of no return, economically and politically. We will never go back to the kind of chaos of the Cultural Revolution, nor go back to the kind of situation that you first saw when you came in on Ping Pong. And I think that's what every rational Chinese wants. They don't want to go back to the chaos that existed.
That's an encouraging note, but on the other hand, one of the last things you mentioned, one of the last words you used in describing modern China was the word struggle. Do you see the liberalization movement as lasting, and do you see some new stability, real stability, coming to the Chinese?
The answer on both is a qualified yes. There is a wonderful article by Orville Schell in one of the monthly magazines, I believe it's Harper's May, where he talks about Fang Lizhi, the astrophysicist, who is sort of the symbol of what's going on in China now. He's been drummed out of the party for his, what I think are marvelous, clear-headed ideas about what China's got to do to come into the 20th century. Drummed out of the party. In the old days, he'd be shoveling out stables in Heilongjiang up in the north. He's in Beijing. He's operating, he's functioning, he's doing research. And in an interview that was on television recently with Zhao Zhiyang, who was then the prime minister, the premier, he said he will continue to do responsible work. We have had some differences, but in effect, we're not doing what we used to do to these folks. The writers, some of the newspaper commentators and so on, becoming increasingly, but then what happens is, in typical Chinese fashion, is having said that, tomorrow you're going to read in the paper that they've cracked down on somebody. So it is not a consistent road.
To the untrained observer, it sometimes seems that populist movements struggling to gain some kind of liberalization from totalitarian governments make the mistake of not knowing when to consolidate, of pushing beyond the limits of tolerance of the parties in power. Is the hardest thing for Deng and his successors going to be to manage the expectation for the liberalization trend to continue and to gain momentum?
I think you've just put your finger on it. I think not only the liberalization trend, but also the kind of consumer expectation that they've built up. So that what you have is an economic base that still cannot deliver the level of consumer expectation that has come because so many Chinese have relatives overseas. And what the Chinese do now, which is wonderful, is, let's say the relatives are in Hong Kong, Singapore, Indonesia, the United States, Canada, Australia. The relatives will get a letter. When you come in, here is what we would like. Sanyo model so-and-so and so on. They will give them the model numbers of what they want, because they know, because there's enough traffic in and out of there, there's enough advertising. The people down in South China, at least in Guangdong province, see Hong Kong television. I mean, you talk about a land of rising expectations. And so the relatives, and I've seen them come in on the train schlepping these packages, you know, of television sets and refrigerators and so on. So there is this enormous, and the Chinese goods produced by the light industry departments are still shoddy. You see that coming and the liberalization coming, and you say, to your point exactly, how fast? How fast? Because China is a tough country to govern. You know, de Gaulle had a great line. He said, France, governing France, très difficile. How can you govern a country that makes 463 different kinds of cheeses? Well, in China, you've got these vast regions, you know, heavy population, different languages, tough folks, lived through all those dynasties. Tough country to govern.
I have a follow-up question, Steve, and it has to do with ideological warfare. And in China, the traditional Marxists, or those that thought they were in the early years of Mao, I know that transition in China is much more intense now than it was earlier in the Soviet Union. How are the modernists, or the so-called revisionists, combating the criticism of the traditionalists that they are really forgetting the Marxist-Leninist or Maoist theories on what the country should have economically and politically and socially?
I think a lot of them are pointing to the improvement in individual living conditions. You know, Deng had a wonderful saying which got him in a lot of trouble with Mao, and he said, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, which is a kind of pragmatic attitude. A lot of the, even the moderates or liberals, or call them what you will, still pay lip service to Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought, and then go and do exactly the opposite. I mean, which is why this astrophysicist Fang is such a wonderful example, because what he's saying is, hey guys, let somebody speak the truth. It's the emperor's clothes. Marxist, Leninist, economics, politics, whatever, doesn't work. Let's start from scratch. You know, we can learn, and we Chinese are capable of learning. So on the one hand, there are those few voices in the wilderness. There are the many cadre who understand what's going on, close one eye like Nelson, and sail on this so-called Maoist, Leninist course, paying lip service to it, but actually paying attention to market forces. And then there are the diehard Maoists who are sitting there simmering since 76, 77, 78, hating all of this that's going on. You know, was this what the revolution was for, so that the young people can have sunglasses and long hair and listen to music from Taiwan? I mean, is this the purity of the Chinese Revolution? So you've got this tussle that's constantly going on. And another reason, to go back to the 13th Party Congress, why it wasn't a clean sweep of the boards by Deng and the rest of the so-called moderates.
I would like to take that one step further and let you give us a couple of examples of how, I guess, for lack of a better term, capitalism is, in some ways, maybe I'm overstating, flourishing in certain aspects, or experimentation with. I don't mean to say it's become a capitalist country, but can you give us some examples of that are the most clear of violation of what Mao would have preferred?
Sure. For example, one thing. Let's go to agriculture, the heart of China. 80% of the country live in the countryside. Over 80 million Chinese are peasants. The government has made a deal with them, 15-year contract. Here are the quotas for the next 15 years. Here's the price. Farmers say, terrific. Okay, we can do that. That's a piece of cake. We'll take care of that. Now we start growing cash crops. Now we know how much we can grow over the state quota. Mao has got to be spinning at that one. So what do? They grow the cash crops. They take them to the free markets. You see more crowds, like in any communist country, at the free markets than you do at the state markets. That forces, in the long run, the state markets either, in China, I think this is going to happen, to go out of business, or to improve. People are starting to be fired. The Iron Rice Bowl, in some instances, seems to have been broken. Factory managers seem to be given more control over some of the... And I'm qualifying everything because with China, you've got to qualify. The other thing is, personal examples. In Shanghai, I take the family to lunch on the last trip at one of my favorite restaurants. Pardon me, walking around the city afterward. Guy comes out of a doorway and says to me, "Hey, I got to come in and eat in my restaurant. I got a restaurant here." I said, "You got a restaurant?" "Oh, yeah, terrific." And the neighbors chime in. "Yeah, he's got a wonderful restaurant. Private enterprise. Go ahead in." Well, that's wonderful, but it didn't happen before. First time I ever saw it was out at the Tombs in Xi'an, when I was wandering through with some delegation, and I came out, and there were these, it was a kind of local ethnic folk selling this wonderful embroidery, bright-colored embroidery, right outside the, in PLA, wandering around, the Army guys wandering. And so I thought, I'm going to give this a double whammy. First of all, they're here, which is mind-boggling. The first time I'd seen it, this is about 5 or 6 years ago. So I went over and started to negotiate with one of the women, and the haggle started. It was like being in a souk in Istanbul, you haggle. I was back at the real China. So there are those kind of things. The figures are mind-boggling of, just in Beijing, shoemakers have come out of the woodwork, barbers, all kinds of trades that in the old days were capitalist leeches, and they went in the woodwork. Now they're back out again. They're all over the city.
Got one more question. I want to leave a lot of time for Steve, and we do have quite a bit of time left. But I just want the program to end without you giving us a chance to give us a profile of Mao. He was one of the fascinating figures of the 20th century, was a dominating figure in Asia. And so since you've had those experiences and contacts, what kind of personality did he have? How did he operate as a leader of a country?
Well, boy, guys who've written books on this. Let me give you a couple of reactions. There was a wonderful book called Backcountry Girl in China, written by a woman who had a Chinese father and a British mother, came back, got involved in the revolution, was the mistress of a high-ranking army official, and would see Mao every day. Okay, this is one of the most telling examples I've ever seen of what happens to a revolution. So she's at Beihai Park, which the communists took over. They took over the best. They knew about real estate. I mean, they really did. They took over the best part of Beijing for their homes and offices and so on. They're out splashing in the lake out there very shortly after the revolution. About 2 years later, she's back again, and she's doing this, and she's splashing Mao. And her friend tapped her on the shoulder and said, no, we don't do that. In that short space of time, from one of the masses to we don't splash him. Well, that happens a lot of times in revolutions, where the hero suddenly begins to read his own press releases and take himself seriously. Constant struggle for Zhou Enlai, who was always sort of the moderating influence. One of the most acute China observers that I have ever met was Stephen Fitzgerald, who was the Australian ambassador to Beijing for a while and wrote a wonderful book on China. And he said to me one day, it's funny, Zhou Enlai was like the really nice uncle that you went to and you could always touch him for $5. And he was always there and sympathetic and had your best interests at heart. And Mao was the father you could never talk to. And the Chinese had that sense too. And then, of course, his love life was worthy of one of the television serials. Jiang Jing showed up in Yan'an, a well-known Shanghai starlet, the veteran of a lot of casting couches, and she comes into Yan'an and very quickly catches Mao's attention and Mao. And the other wife, who had made the long march with him and bore some children by him and so on, she was shunted off. The deal that was made by some outraged Communist Party members, like Zhu De, the old general and so on, was she never gets involved in politics. And so she had a minor job in, I think, the Film Commission, censoring films or something, until the power of the other guys sort of waned a bit. And then she stepped in, and she was one of the heavy hitters in the Cultural Revolution.
Thank you. Steve Shink.
We've talked about economics as sort of the driving force behind Chinese liberalization. One of the jewels, at least in the crown of Asian economics, has got to be Hong Kong. What will happen in a very short time from now when the British lose their lease on on that city.
Yeah, that's 1997, and people are worried about that and have been. That was an interesting. Well, let me give you a little bit of background on that. Margaret Thatcher did not listen to her advisors. She had some very good advisors at that point in Hong Kong, very astute, and they said, look, she wanted to make this trip to Beijing. She was going to meet with Deng Xiaoping. They said, don't touch Hong Kong. What do you mean, don't touch Hong Kong? They said, just leave it alone. All the signals we're getting from China are just leave it alone. Don't bring it up. Well, there was a bit of nervousness in the land markets and mortgages and things like that, which they'd reached the magic circle in terms of the years between then and 1997. She went in and started to lecture Deng like a school teacher, and Deng became furious. And when she brought up Hong Kong, he said, if you want to talk about that, we'll talk about that. And she then started to negotiate with him, saying, you know, we're going to keep the island and we're going to keep the new territories up to Boundary Street and so on. And he objected to that, and she said, we don't like doing business with people who don't adhere to their treaties. At which point, Deng, who was a really fiery Sichuanese, got furious because the Chinese view of those treaties is that they were imposed on a weak China by strong foreign powers. The meeting became a shambles. She left, and people started to try to patch together what was going to happen in Hong Kong. Then the Chinese started making dumb statements. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. Panic in Hong Kong. Hong Kong operates on rumors. The stock market operates on rumors. A shambles. Real estate prices plummeting, and so on. Finally, somebody, and I think it must have been Deng, stepped in and said, shut up, he explained. Knock it off. Let's stabilize this thing. And they began slowly. They appointed a working group in China. The Brits appointed a working group to try to put this together. I think what's going to happen is that the communists are going to try their best to leave it alone. But I'm not sure whether they know how to do that, given the way they govern China. The people in Hong Kong, 52,000 last year, applied for police clearance to leave, to emigrate. There's a brain drain, mitigated only by the fact that some of them are doing a very Chinese thing of going to other countries, getting passports, then coming back to China, hedging their bets. So everybody's waiting for the other shoe to drop. And the Chinese are saying, what are they nervous about? Look what we did in Shanghai. And the people in Hong Kong are saying, exactly. You didn't do very well up there, and we don't want to see the same thing happen to Hong Kong.
And I may be mischaracterizing this, but there was something that appeared not too long ago in National Geographic, I believe, about independent economic zones or independent industrial zones that the Chinese had created in the mainland, maybe an attempt to emulate what had happened in Hong Kong, at least the theory being that they would establish areas that would be run like private capitalist enterprises like Hong Kong, and hope to gain the economic success without tainting some of the gains of the Cultural Revolution, if they still wanted to at least give lip service to that. What's happened with that experience? Has it been any successful at all?
Yeah, they've had some problems with it. Actually, they'll never admit this, but Taiwan was the first one to start with the free economic zones, the first one down in Kaohsiung. The Chinese over past Chongqing across the border have one. They have another one up in what used to be Amoy. They are learning the hard way that when foreign investors come in, they come in to make money. They don't want to deal with a surly and lazy workforce. They don't want to deal with an obstructionist bureaucracy. They don't want to deal with people who can't deliver. They're there to make a profit. This was very difficult for the Chinese, after all these years, to understand the workings of capitalism, because that's what they were, enclaves of capitalism. The information I get now is that those things have improved, they're not ideal, and that they need a lot more work on the part of the Chinese.
How do you characterize the average Chinese worker of today? Has that person lived under the teachings of Mao so long that they've forgotten their heritage? A great mercantile nation at one time, thousands of years ago. Is that spirit still lurking right under the surface of the average Chinese?
I think so. I think it was right there up until 40, 49. It was a thin veneer. It is a thin veneer. And yeah, I think it's there. But what happened is the uneducated worker who shows up at the factory or doesn't show up that often, who gets his paycheck and so on, and he gets his price allotment, and he gets this and he gets that. that spoils folks pretty easily. So what you've got to do to snap them out of that is, A, start firing the ones that really won't change, give economic incentives to get them to change, and that indicates a flexibility that until recently that system did not have. So I think the younger, better educated workers, the ones who are in it and say, you know, wow, what you know, how can I advance and so on, it's a generational problem, that they are going to do better than these folks who are in their, let's say 30 to 50 range, who have been spoiled by the Iron Rice Bowl, by getting that paycheck, you know, every month, and all of the supplemental things that come with it.
Do you see China as the dominant economic force in Asia in the near future?
Not in the near future. I think they've got a long way to go, but they're getting there much more quickly than I think anybody else would have anticipated. I would say probably somewhere in the mid to early 21st century.
In a very short period of time we have left, I always ask the long question, but the relationship between the Soviet Union and China, the Sino-Soviet split, has been a rather long one and serious. Is that going to change in the near future?
I think it's going to get warmer, but by really incremental degrees. There's a lot more trading now, barter trading going on in the northern border up around Heilongjiang. Interestingly enough, up around the area where they had their more severe border conflicts, I don't think we're going to see in the immediate future, a summit between Deng and Gorbachev. But there were three conditions the Chinese had. One, back off some of the troops from the border. The Russians seem to be prepared to do that, and in fact, I think in some instances have. Get your troops out of Afghanistan. Looks like they're going to do that. Third, get the Vietnamese out of Cambodia. That's going to take a little bit longer. Until those conditions are fulfilled, there isn't going to be any formal breakthrough. But conditions certainly are better than they were when the Chinese changed the name of the street that the Russian embassy is on to Anti-Revisionist Street.
Yes, the glasnost, I guess, and Gorbachev and the new government in China is helping that some.
I think so.
I wish we could continue this. It's just been absolutely fascinating. I know Steve joins me in thanking you, and it's been so informative to our audience here on campus and to our viewers on television. I want to also publicly thank you for being so generous with your time on our campus with the students and the faculty administration and with our viewing audience.
Well, I think I probably learned more than the students did.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest this week and last week is Jack Reynolds, a correspondent for many, many years with NBC and one of the most prominent correspondents with any of the major networks. And I know you've enjoyed this program this week, and you did last week. I want to invite you to be with us again next week, when at that time we'll discuss what we believe to be an important topic. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.